Previously on Superhero Rewind. I thought it was a direct adaptation. I remember the insane amount of flashbacks. It has that standard 80s, 90s cartoon rule of destroy but never kill. The relationship drama is often superficial, and some of the silly stuff, intentional or otherwise, is part of the charm. I'll still rank the episodes, but you'll hear about them out of ranked order. My third pick is Mysterio's debut episode, The Menace of Mysterio. Bet could have saved us from The Mummy Returns, the Clash of the Titans remake, and Green Lantern. Next up already, it's my number one pick, the 3-part episode from Season 1, The Alien Costume. The check's in the mail, baby! My number 6 pick is The Insidious 6 and Battle of the Insidious 6, All the Crime! My 5th pick is The Mutant Agenda. The others feel really shoehorned in, especially at the beginning, when they all show up and pose for a pinup poster. My 9th pick is Shriek of the Vulture and The Final Nightmare. You'll never see me again! Hulu. Hulu? No! Oh, there we go. My number 2 pick is Enter the Green Goblin. Famously, the Hobgoblin appears in the show before the Green Goblin, and frequently. He's well established before Norman Osborn finally puts on the green and purple duds. Hobgoblin's identity hasn't even been revealed by this point, already a few episodes into Season 3, not that I think that was a burning question anyone was really asking. And then when it's finally played as a mystery, it's real Power Rangers. Gee, maybe the bad guy's secret identity is that squeaky clean, arrogant gazillionaire you just introduced to date Felicia Hardy. I imagine it was ultra disappointing, if not insulting, to diehard comic fans that Green Goblin, at least at first glance, looks like a knockoff of the original Goblin, the Hobgoblin, especially since a lot of them consider Green Goblin Spider-Man's definitive arch-nemesis. That would be like starting with Harley Quinn, giving her and Batman a long, colorful history, and then introducing the Joker as a derivative spin-off character of hers. Except she's at least a related character. The Goblins hate each other, but that's true here too. Sandman and Electro weren't available at the start of the show because of the James Cameron movie in production at the time, which obviously never saw the light of day because of constant legal and budget issues. But that's not why Hobgoblin came before the Green Goblin. According to a Facebook post John Semper made in 2015, the showrunner hired before him decided, for whatever reason, to do the Hobgoblin instead of the Green Goblin. If that guy hadn't been axed before Semper came aboard, the show may never have included the Hobgoblin at all. To Semper's credit, he wanted to do the Osborn Goblin, but because of that early decision, there were already a bunch of Hobgoblin toys in production for Christmas, so Fox insisted on Hobgoblin appearing in the show. That's why the Osborn-Hobgoblin rivalry is established early on, and why the Goblin tech is still an Osborn invention. So when the series finally got to him, I assume not until Season 3 because his transformation isn't related to neogenics, Norman wouldn't look like he was ripping off the Hobgoblin. It was his tech and even aesthetic from the beginning. And once the Green Goblin finally appears, it's with relative weight and gravitas, handled with the kind of care and reverence Venom was. That's a lot of why it makes my list. It earns the moment the Green Goblin calls himself the real Goblin. That's a nod to how it's supposed to be, according to the comics, and a bone thrown to print fans. But it's also true in the context of the story. The Hobgoblin is an opportunist who stole the suit and glider, a pretender trying to dethrone the Kingpin through sheer intimidation and tenacity, which is what I love about him. But this Goblin is the genuine article. I don't love that the green suit is just a discolored Hobgoblin suit. The green gas stains it, and that's why it's that color, though it somehow also adds some purple. Kind of like how the acid turns the Joker's face white and his hair green, which, come to think of it, is a little ironic. The Hobgoblin is voiced by Mark Hamill, and that's a character that likes to create chaos like the Joker, though he's not the same brand of crazy. But Osborn's tragic backstory is a lot like the Joker's, and that's not the Goblin voiced by Mark Hamill. I also find it odd that everyone immediately assumes the Green Goblin is a different person, even before he starts announcing that he's the one true Goblin. How do Spider-Man and the Kingpin know he's not the Hobgoblin in a new getup? I mean, it's the exact same costume, just colored differently. Meanwhile, when Peter put on the alien costume, which is not just a repainted version of the same suit, not one person questioned whether it was the original Spider-Man. Everyone was like, hey, Spidey got a new suit. You know, like the show wanted to make sure we knew it was still him. But here, because it is someone different, everyone intuitively knows that. If people's instincts are that advanced in this world, it should be a lot harder to keep a secret identity. And for Fisk to operate secretly is the kingpin of all the crime. All the crime! And this time, he blows a wall to trap Spider-Man and the Goblin, and is crazy enough to tell J. Jonah Jameson we have to rid the world of both of those maniacs. With a thumbs up, no less. Really, Fisk? You're not worried Jameson might publish a story about that and ruin your image? You know, like he just did with Norman and the gas? This one is wonderfully dense and gets a whole lot done in 22 minutes, and not in the stuff to the brim, I don't even know what just happened way so many of these are handled. I'm actually in awe of how tight and economical this episode is without a second part. It's much closer to why Batman the Animated Series episodes tended to be paced, and it feels more effortless in squeezing in a lot of story without feeling hurried. It helps that Osborn and his criminal dealings are already established before this, but it watches great on its own and still takes the brunt of most of the important legwork. And although you expect Norman Osborn to be the Goblin by the end if you're familiar with the source material, this episode makes a fairly good mystery of it. After all, there's already been so many story departures from the comics that the show can use that to its advantage and keep us guessing. Both Norman and Harry have motive and opportunity to be the Goblin, and the episode makes a good case for either of them, making the audience suspicious of Harry along with Peter and Mary Jane. The only problem with trying to make the audience guess is we're told too early that Green Goblin has super strength, and that makes Norman instantly more plausible than Harry, who wasn't exposed to an experimental gas in what looks like a typical supervillain origin scene. Fisk wants Osborn's agility and strength-enhancing gas yesterday, for some reason in a massive hurry to get in the chemical warfare business. I'm honestly not sure what the gas was originally even intended to do. We're not told. But that's what it does for Osborn when he's exposed, besides also giving him a dark alternate persona that's sick of Norman's lack of backbone and his tendency to let people like Fisk control him. Fisk threatens him and his family, saying he has no use for them if the gas can't be completed. To make matters worse, his board of directors has turned against him because he's developing the gas, and it's bad PR for all of them. They're pretending to be humanitarians, but they've all done equally bad things to make a buck or to preserve their reputations, and it's really all about politics. That includes Jameson and Felicia Hardy's mother. So if Osborn completes and sells the gas, his career is over, but if he doesn't, his and his son's lives are over. In desperation, he moves Dr. Strom aside and works on the gas himself, but in his distress, forgets to seal an airlock, and he exposes himself to the gas and blows up the building. I really like the motivation behind what leads to his villainifying himself in this version. More than just losing his livelihood and legacy, like in the first Raimi movie, he risks losing his son to a ruthless mobster, and worse, it's his fault for not having the strength to stand up to the Kingpin in the first place. He let fear, and maybe greed too, get in the way of his responsibility. So not only are the stakes high and personal, but they're consequences of his poor and illegal choices. And the Goblin becomes a manifestation of his frustrations with his own insecurities and self-doubt, which channels itself against Osborn's enemies, blaming them all for his failures and misfortunes. When a statue of Justice with the Goblin's face on it falls on him at the end, the symbolism is clear. Osborn is responsible for his own actions. The Goblin is a direct result of his choice to allow himself to be controlled by an evil man. The Goblin is just a new evil that's controlling him, albeit one that claims to have his best interests at heart, and he can't help it. This one's a mental disorder he can't stop, but it's the ultimate consequence of his refusal to do the right thing, like the black costume and the man-spider both could have been for Spider-Man if he put himself before the more selfless and heroic choice. When he doesn't remember anything about the Goblin at the end, and I'm reading this admittedly with some hindsight, the price Osborn has to make for not taking control of his own life is a lack of control, the inability to choose. He's the perfect foil for Spider-Man, and again, it's more compelling than the better-known movie version where he wants his board dead for not believing in his project, kills them, and then flies around menacingly the rest of the movie. This Goblin personality reflects the dark side of this particular individual, and reveals something deep-rooted and broken within him. This episode makes Harry's plunge to the dark side later more tragic because he could have taken one here, and he is endearing and sympathetic for not doing that. He blames the board for driving his father to his demise, and that makes Peter and MJ think he might be the Goblin. They certainly aren't blameless. The Goblin is right when he calls theirs crimes of hypocrisy. But again, Norman got himself into this situation, and he's responsible for his own choices. But rather than seeking revenge, Harry investigates the rubble, looking for any sign that his father's alive. Ultimately, his labors result in rescuing the board and Mary Jane, who the Goblin hilariously has extra shackles at the ready for, even though he has the whole board already and he didn't plan on taking her. That only happens because he finds her snooping around. Once again, we have characters acting more reasonable here. Mary Jane, although through some really stilted and melodramatic dialogue, feels horrible for suspecting Harry, but she has good reason. At this point, she and Harry are in a serious relationship, and she's noticed his dark side. She says because he was unloved as a child. It's hard not to laugh at the way she says that, but it tells us more about Osborn's mistakes. If Harry were capable of this, his upbringing is partially to blame. The fact that he remains hopeful suggests there may be more to his relationship with his father than MJ realizes. And given Norman's reaction when Harry saves him, and his newfound dedication to his son by the end, it tells us there's a loving, nurturing person there who buried that side of himself in the name of his business. The optimism is that we all have both sides and the freedom to act on either. This story is more the Osborns than it is Spider-Man's. He's given opportunities to do the selfish thing, like Norman, but always chooses to do the right thing because Osborn is paying for never learning lessons he has. This is one place where it does feel like Peter has matured over the course of the series, and I'm seeing that change writing about these select episodes in a way that felt less organic moving through the series. Peter considers telling Mary Jane he also suspects Harry because he may have a chance with her again, with Harry out of the picture, but he chooses not to exploit the situation and instead advocates for giving their friend the benefit of the doubt until he gives them a real reason to doubt him. By the end, he's rewarded for his maturity when MJ praises him for standing by his friend, which speaks to his character and gives her reason to fall for him later. And he's also rewarded as Spider-Man by Felicia, who makes out with him for rescuing her mother, beginning a classic superhero identity crisis that continues into the 4th season, about the girl who likes one of your personas and another girl who's in love with the other. Spider-Man can't even assume it's because chicks dig the car. The psychological stuff is sophisticated for this show, and I'm impressed that the Green Goblin is such a great foil for Spider-Man and doesn't feel like a rehash of the other Goblin. Oh, and the animation is some of the best in the series. I love the atmospheric lighting off of Spider-Man with the fire and explosions at the beginning, and the Goblin is legitimately frightening. My 7th pick is Framed and The Man Without Fear from Season 3. This two-parter is on the list admittedly more for concept than execution, or perhaps I should say more because of visual and character execution over story execution. It's a pretty contrived situation, but it's worth it to see what I think is an inspired look and sound for Daredevil. It's a shame, bordering on a crime, that he never appeared again, much less that he didn't spin off into his own show. Nearly everybody who appears in this show, hero or villain, gets a follow-up episode, unless we see them first in Season 5, like the Fantastic Four. Punisher, Blade, and Nick Fury all come back, but not Daredevil. Not the guy who should be Kingpin's other arch-nemesis. It hardly makes sense that 3 seasons in, Spider-Man is just now crossing paths with a guy whose life was ruined by Fisk and who wants justice for the death of his father, especially because Daredevil knows Fisk is the Kingpin. Peter, astonishingly, doesn't know that yet, but like 80% of the crime he fights is connected to Kingpin's criminal empire. You'd think he and Daredevil would constantly be smacking into each other, not to mention every other street-level superhero in New York. Crime fighters fight crime, and again, he runs all of it. Even worse, we see Daredevil's very first confrontation with Kingpin here. What exactly has Matt Murdock been doing to combat Fisk all this time? He knows who he is. Even if he doesn't have enough evidence to get him arrested, can't he easily follow Fisk and get it? He is the man without fear. What's he afraid of? At the very least, Daredevil should have been a recurring ally, like Black Cat, and I wish he'd had something to do with Kingpin's inevitable capture, which is a footnote at the end of 6 Forgotten Warriors, and is as anticlimactic as it gets. Chameleon double-crosses him because he's Electro's brother, and Electro is Red Skull's son-turned-ultimate weapon, which Kingpin was trying to get his hands on, not knowing what it was. Like he started singing the song that never ends. And I'm convinced the Tick episode, Grandpa Wore Tights, is a direct parody of this episode, with the terror after an ultimate weapon hidden by the Decency Squad in the 40s, a group of Golden Age heroes who suit up one last time, with an elderly supervillain who's taken down by his son that tried to follow in his footsteps, but who he doesn't appreciate. But anyway, yeah, Kingpin gets knocked out when Electro displays his powers and is thrown into a paddy wagon 5 minutes into the episode, and we never see him again. If the show had gotten a 6th season, I imagine he would have broken out and resumed kingpinning, but as it is, it's a really disappointing finish for the series' main bad guy. As for why Daredevil never returned, the only thing I can figure is that he was introduced too late. A lot of the characters who get a follow-up in Season 4 are introduced in 2, to the point where Partners in Danger, on the whole, plays to me like a sequel to Neogenic Nightmare. And Daredevil wasn't part of that season, but I have no idea why Spider-Man didn't think of him when he was recruiting heroes for the Secret War, among them Captain America, who we get a flashback for in 3 and who appears in the present day in 4, Iron Man, who shows up in 3, and the Fantastic Four, who never appeared in the show until Secret Wars. Kingpin's confrontation with Daredevil here plays like an epic showdown that comes out of nowhere unless you're a Daredevil fan and you already associate these characters. It watches like it's there to appease Daredevil fans, and if only Daredevil had spun into his own show, it might have. Studio censorship would have made a street-level Daredevil show even more challenging to realize, but I love what's here. It watches like a backdoor pilot with a style all its own when Daredevil takes center stage. It's sufficiently broody and as gritty as a Fox cartoon could be. I love all the black space around the suit and some of his action, where we're with Matt and the rest of the world falls away because he doesn't need to see to do what he does. And I like the look of the radar sense, which is similar to how it would look later in the live-action film. In fact, a lot of what's done here reminds me of the movie, and I'd be surprised if that production didn't look at this, given that it was one of the few screen adaptations of the character prior to that, and Avi Arad was involved in both. I'm not sure about Daredevil's theme in the score, though. It's very vigilante adventure serial, a little like the Grey Ghost in Batman, and it kind of fits, but it feels pointlessly throwbacky. Richard Fisk, who we've never seen involved with his father's business until now, frames Peter for selling vague government secrets. And the whole thing was Smythe's idea, an idea that, when it doesn't work out and nearly exposes Wilson Fisk as the Kingpin, has him stepping on thin ice. That's a maneuvering device to set up the ultimate Spider Slayer and feels kind of forced in. Smythe had this crappy idea. He suddenly shows up after the plan is already unraveling as if it was an afterthought in the middle of writing the episode. It doesn't help that Fisk is right. It is a bad idea. So bad, it's impossible to believe Fisk went along with it. They decide to have Fisk hire Peter for a diagnostic position under the pretense of thanking him for saving Fisk from the Hobgoblin that one time. Then they put government secrets on the diagnostic disc he burns every day and set him up to take the fall. Richard Fisk then breaks him out of prison, so there will be no doubt in anyone's mind that he's guilty, since he escaped, and then he tries to murder Peter. That way, the feds will have a permanently at-large fugitive, and no one will suspect the Fisks. That's also insanely elaborate. I get that Peter's a good candidate given his parents' alleged betrayal against their country. Spoiler alert, they weren't really traitors. That's something Fisk knows that Peter doesn't yet, more paving the way for things to come. Really dull, uninteresting things. But wouldn't it still be simpler to use someone already in your employ, and maybe less suspicious? And if the government knows your company is conspiring against the country, wouldn't you be under investigation regardless of who they found a disc with? The whole situation is ridiculous, but I like a lot of what it leads to. Matt Murdock represents Peter in court, a famous, highly sought-after attorney secretly paid for by J. Jonah Jameson, which is a great and kind of touching reveal toward the end. I like Peter put in a position where he can't really be the hero and needs someone else to rescue him, and by the second part, it turns into a team-up with Spider-Man helping Daredevil to clear himself, unbeknownst to Daredevil, which is fun, as it's the classic conceit that neither knows the other's identity, even though it should be pretty obvious. Matt has a friend named Daredevil that helps him with his cases after hours. Sure, you'd never suspect the blind lawyer, except Peter can see just fine, and Matt's purple Daredevil tunic is visible under his bathrobe. You also once again have the obligatory superhero fight like you do in the X-Men episode, but it's a little more natural here because Daredevil has every reason to suspect Spider-Man might be trying to frame Peter Parker. We get a backstory for Matt, and hilariously, part of it is given to us by Matt talking to himself after he's told Peter everything up to his gaining superpowers. He just starts telling himself the rest of his own origin so we'll have it. And I like that the parallels and contrasts between them are brought front and center, mainly regarding their fathers. And there's an inherent contrast with how they were each raised and how Uncle Ben raised Peter. Matt's father wanted the best for him, but set a poor example when he resorted to becoming a low-level enforcer to pay the bills and stay in the Kingpin's good graces, which leads to Matt's accident, when he runs into a truck full of chemicals after the horror of seeing his father beat up a man in the street. Matt grows up trying to learn from his father's mistakes, but also wanting revenge after Kingpin has him killed. Fisk isn't good enough for his father, who is a low-level thug like Matt's father, but is there more by choice and wants to essentially be the Kingpin. Wilson tries to impress his father by helping him on the street, but he can't keep up, and his father sacrifices him so he can escape the police. Years later, he destroys his father's life when he gets out of prison in retribution, his father who is finally proud of him. So instead of learning responsibility because of his own mistakes or learning to be better than his father was, Fisk develops a survival of the strongest attitude. My favorite moment in the episode is when, having done the same thing to his son that his father did to him, turning Richard over to the police rather than letting himself be taken, he wonders how long it will be before his son enacts his vengeance on him as he did to his father. He knows the vicious cycle will never end, and no one can be the king of the hill forever, but he has lied, killed, and used people for so long, there's no going back. I also like that this happened shortly after his wife has left him. Now he has nothing but his empire. I only wish we'd seen the prodigal son scenario play out later on. With the success of Netflix's Daredevil, the character is more appreciated and understood now than he ever has been, but had he spun off here, I think he might have been thought of more as an A-list hero by the mainstream a couple decades earlier. He's immediately a fresh and different hero from Spider-Man, and this show has a decent handle on what he's all about, even the blurred line between vengeance and justice. I don't know how you do a Daredevil show with the same series villain as Spider-Man's, but maybe he just wouldn't show up as much here. Maybe he'd have Smythe's sick devil slayers on Daredevil. My fourth pick is the penultimate episode of Season 3, The Spot. The Spot is one of those quirky, intentionally ridiculous-looking villains fans like to make fun of that I have an undeniable love for. He's like the Clock King. The Spot has a cool power, but a nutty costume. But how else is a guy who can produce and control interdimensional portals at will supposed to look? Especially since it isn't really a costume, but just a skin-tight lab suit with all his portals attached to it, including the one that stretches to look like a domino mask. I like how different he is from the rest of Spider-Man's rogues. He's another tragic scientist victimized by the Kingpin, but he doesn't have delusions of grandeur, and he's not a psychopath. He's another guy messing around with science he doesn't fully understand and can't control, like Stillwell and Connors. But he's like one of them if he had some personality and a sense of humor. And he's a lot quicker to realize his science is causing more harm than good and to try to clean up his own mess. Of course, a giant portal that threatens to suck up the whole Earth is a more urgent threat than a mutated lizard or a scorpion man. Owen is the mad scientist turned hero. He loses everything in the end, but he isn't left a hideous creature or forced to continue working for an evil entity that controls him. He ends up with an immense amount of power and takes advantage of it with good intentions. He's trying to give the Kingpin stable portal technology so he can get himself and the woman he loves out from under Kingpin's thumb, but he ends up threatening the world because of his abuse of power and desperation. He does almost let that power consume him when he thinks he can take the Kingpin down single-handedly, but when he realizes that there are different kinds of power, like leverage, he recognizes that there's always someone else more powerful than you, and he's just a good soul who doesn't really want that kind of control in the first place. He just wanted to prove he could make Stark's unstable portal tech work. By the end, he does the responsible Spider-Man thing and cleans up his own mess, rather than making it worse like most of these villains do. He sacrifices himself for the greater good and gets to spend eternity with the woman he loves, who jumps into the portal he can only stop from the inside with him. Or they poof into nothingness. No way to really know. When the Green Goblin gets trapped in one of these things, he'll exist in a limbo where he doesn't seem to need to eat, but who knows what happens to Dr. Owen and Sylvia. Naturally, the Spot is one of my favorites, and he never comes back, though I'm not sure I'd want him in Season 4 and 5 when the show loses some of its sense of fun, and this episode is dripping with it. It was written exclusively by one writer who isn't John Semper, which is unusual, and the writing is a little sharper and wittier than average, back to the quality of Insidious 6, I'd say. The writer is James KRIEG, who has a lot of animation credits, and this absurd, quippy material is his forte. He's written most of the LEGO Justice League movies, including Attack of the Legion of Doom, which is my favorite, so I already admired his comedy writing and didn't realize it. Incidentally, he also wrote the Flashpoint Paradox. He seems to be a go-to guy for big cosmic or super science stuff. The show's overall flavor is more whimsical and lighter, but you can take it seriously in the context of a heightened end world when the stakes get high. It's more aware of its absurdity, like I think the whole series should be, even while the characters mostly play it straight. I mean, Spider-Man makes fun of Spot's costume, but he does that to most of its opponents as a distraction tactic and sometimes to hide his fear. Not that fear is why he's doing it here. Even compared to the costumed maniacs he's gone up against before, the Spot looks silly until you know what his gimmick is. Usually, you can tell. Oh, that's a rhino. That's a vulture. That's a polka dot guy. I love Spider-Man's joke when he first sees the Spot. Shouldn't you be the mascot at a fire station or something? And this episode includes my favorite line in the entire series, which I've quoted in a previous rewind. When a massive portal threatens to devour everything, Kingpin offers to help Spider-Man and Owen, and Landon loses it. Why would you want to help them? KRIEG then makes fun of half the villains on Saturday morning television by giving Kingpin this response. There is no profit in the destruction of the planet. It is very bad for business. Not sure why Landon didn't think of that, but it's one of the best things anyone has ever given a villain to say. Some villains are psychopaths who worship the end of all things, and some are ruthless despots who want to control everything. Yet often on TV, evil is good to a villain no matter what form it takes. You gotta know if your bad guy wants to take over the world or destroy it. That's very important. This isn't just a throwaway jaunt around Portal Land either, it's setting the stage for the season cliffhanger. Portals and goblins are going to be the crux of a lot of what's to come, and it includes a monumental moment, the first physical confrontation between Spider-Man and Kingpin. Kingpin, who somewhat famously tries to crush Spider-Man and claims that only 2% of his body mass is fat, and he's got 350 pounds of pure muscle. That's a thing that seems to stick with people, I think because we rarely see Fisk do his own dirty work, and it's a big deal that he's such a force to be reckoned with when he does. When you're a kid, everything like that sounds like a superpower. Oh, Kingpin isn't just a bad guy, he has almost superhuman strength and can take on Spider-Man. Peter's character arc here is a little easy and manufactured, as if the episode is struggling not to make him the generic superhero who helps a guy in Own who's down on his luck but doesn't really learn anything himself in the process. Peter rushes off at the carnival to save people from the portals, and Mary Jane is angry, thinking he ditched her to take pictures after complimenting him for being so attentive lately. I don't know, if you think it's a chore for the guy you're dating to spend time with you and you aren't confident that he's not attentive, and it's because his time is stretched with obligations like, doing his job, it might be time to move on. She does that immature elementary school playground talking through another girl thing to tell Peter she's mad. So by the end, after seeing Owen and his girlfriend go off to oblivion together, another soulmates from second one relationship like so many in this show, Peter thinks he should prioritize Mary Jane and stop being Spider-Man, while I'm wondering how he expects to be a photographer dating her. Then she suddenly changes her tune and seems to have had a character arc in some other episode we didn't see, where now she appreciates that he has a job and he can't be joined with her at the hip 24/7 to do it. So now that she's suddenly not so selfish and possessive, he feels like he can keep being Spider-Man. First, was he really prepared not to run off and save the next roller coaster full of people about to get sucked into a vortex because he's putting Mary Jane first now? Second, Sylvia supports and loves Owen because of his big heart and sense of responsibility. Peter should know that if it's remotely possible to marry the superhero and personal sides of his life, he has to have someone who understands both, which is why he's still torn between Mary Jane and Felicia. But this strikes me as the time to start considering telling MJ his secret, or to let them both down easy because of the danger, which he's worried about. Seeing Owen and Sylvia jump through a hole in space-time together to save the world should have Peter mortified of dating at all. Also, there's an incredibly unsubtle hint that Felicia's boyfriend Jason is the Hobgoblin when he wins a carnival game involving a goblin head, and then Hobgoblin shows up at the end with plans of his own for the portal technology. I know it's a cartoon, but I constantly feel like it's more impressed with its own mysteries and intrigue than I am. Otherwise, it's a refreshingly fun episode and the most quotable of the series. My number 10 pick from Season 4 is Return of the Green Goblin. This one makes the list over Goblin War and Turning Point, because I think the story is less hackneyed, and because Harry's trauma and the sins of Norman Osborn driving him over the edge is much more compelling than the Goblin taking Norman over again just to manufacture a Death of Gwen Stacy kind of situation, not to mention the Hobgoblin's lame backstory and arguable reinvention. This story would have been perfect for the sins of the father's umbrella, as it's all about a father's actions destroying his son, a man who's worked hard to be better than his dad, but who has difficulty fighting against his upbringing and temper. But of course, Mary Jane getting sucked into limbo is the season cliffhanger, so this story has to happen during Partners in Danger, an overall weak season despite some nice relationship stuff with Black Cat. This is my only pick from that season. The Goblin stuff in general makes for some of the more memorable stories in this series, even if they watch like watered-down versions of superior comic book stories. At the end of last season, the Goblin discovers Peter is Spider-Man and goes after Mary Jane for conspiring with Peter to get together and hurt Harry to get at Norman, because the Goblin is a manifestation of Norman's paranoia. He kidnaps Mary Jane and, in the commotion of a fight with Spider-Man, drops her into a really convenient portal that opens when he drops the time dilation device. There's all this talk about how you need to know what you're doing to operate it properly, but it just hits the bridge and that flips the switch. You'd think you'd want to make it a little harder to rip holes in space-time. Spider-Man, in his rage, damages the portal device, but the Goblin tries to use it anyway, opening a portal that acts more like a black hole and sucks in everything around it. Spider-Man hesitates, wanting revenge, but pulls himself together and tries to save him. The Goblin knocks himself in with his own glider, because that episode does all the big comic highlights, but with portals. Osborn learns Peter's secret with a portal. Death of Gwen Stacy with Mary Jane and via portal. Death of Osborn by his own hand with a portal. So now the Goblin has apparently completely taken over Osborn's body, though he claims Norman is gone a lot. And it's confusing because his whole goal is making life better for Osborn. Maybe it's an intentional conflict of the personalities where the Goblin hates Norman's weaknesses and sees himself as better, but also wants to save him because he's a part of Osborn's psyche. It's hard to tell if any of that's intentional. Somehow, the Goblin comes to Harry from limbo and tells him he has to goblinify himself to help him get out of the other dimension. This is another admittedly ultra-contrived way to get Harry in the Goblin suit. The episode practically comes out and says it doesn't make sense, but asks us to go along with it anyway. The Goblin doesn't understand why he's able to see into our dimension any more than we do, and why Harry is the only person who can see him. He seems to be communicating with him telepathically. Harry sees him in reflective surfaces like he's hallucinating, and initially thinks that's what's going on. But as the Goblin suggests, it can't be a figment of Harry's imagination, because the Goblin knows where the Goblin's lair is. And because we know how he got stranded in limbo, and he tells that story to Harry. It would have been more compelling if a mystery was made of this like the mystery in Enter the Green Goblin, to make the audience wonder if Harry had lost it and was maybe realizing his father was the Goblin, seeing something of his father in himself, and developing his own version of that personality after a psychotic break. But that would have been a different story, and while the impetus for it is nonsense, I like the idea of the same Goblin somehow transcending Norman Osborn and being the Goblin twice in different bodies, which is sort of what happens. When Harry ends up on the Goblin gas, he starts to develop the high-pitched Goblin voice, but continues to be guided by the original. He seems to just be gradually going insane rather than developing a second personality, and I think it may have been more effective without the gas at all. While the story is deeply flawed, it has some fantastic haunting imagery and unsettling moments with Harry as he completely unravels. After the toxic combination of Mary Jane's disappearance, the Green Goblin talking to him like he's schizophrenic through glass, revealing that his father is behind the mask, and twisting things in his mind to make him hate Peter and Spider-Man. The dream sequence is almost alien costume good, wonderfully surreal, and I especially like the castle with the Goblin face. I wish somehow that was the Green Goblin's actual hideout. This episode also features a hilarious subplot with the Punisher that converges with the Goblin story when he promises Anna Watson to find out what happened to Mary Jane. He finds her at a graveyard talking to her late husband, and she invites him, a battle-clad man wearing a giant skull on his shirt, to her house. This insufferable woman, easily the most hateful, despicable, morally bereft character in the show, maybe even over the Kingpin, is such a lousy judge of character. She thinks Peter is the most irresponsible guy there is, but can't tell that she's talking to an unhinged lunatic. She really out-Aunt Nell's Aunt Nell from Smallville. The Punisher is having a crisis of conscience because he made a vow to his family to make the world a safer place, but with all the lowlifes he's taken out, sorry kids, the show won't say this, but they're dead, okay? He's the Punisher. He ruthlessly executes people he thinks the world is better off without. They're dead. That's what he's talking about. The streets aren't any safer. I really like that. He's not leading by example, just killing bad people, and that's not solving the problems that create those lowlifes in the first place. While Spider-Man, often tempted by revenge like he was with the Green Goblin when he lost Mary Jane, tries to act with his conscience, knowing from experience that when you're just out to make yourself feel better, you tend to make problems worse. Punisher follows Peter to Green Goblin's hideout. Peter, who Aunt Nell, or Watson, says is the scum of the earth and thinks he's figured it out. Peter must be the Green Goblin. That's another commercial break that tries to make us think someone knows he's Spider-Man. I like Peter trying to maneuver the Goblin glider, thinking that would be enough to drive anyone insane, and his line to the Punisher when the real Goblin shows up: "That must be me up there!" The Punisher doesn't end up accomplishing a lot except feeling useful to a horrible old crone, because Mary Jane shows up at the end out of the blue. That seems like really convenient timing until later when we find out it's actually a clone, and the timing is still really convenient. Spider-Man captures Harry. He's cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs and remains pretty sympathetic while still being somewhat responsible for his actions. He knows he's not crazy before he gets on the gas and should tell Peter or Doc Connors or someone about the voice in his head telling him things he couldn't possibly know. But he's too desperate to find his father, and he lets the Goblin take advantage of that. It's easily the weakest story on this list, but one of the best looking episodes, and I love its haunting atmosphere. My 8th pick is the series finale, I Really, Really Hate Clones, and Farewell Spider-Man. The series finale is easily one of its most memorable episodes, and it's the one I've gone back to most frequently, just because it took me by such surprise the first time I saw it. So much about it was really novel at the time. First, it was an animated series with a true send-off. Most of my favorite shows didn't get one of those, not even Batman the Animated Series, which wasn't serialized like this, but even still, you might imagine a big event, go out with a bang. But that show wasn't really canceled. It was revamped as a show aimed more at younger kids, and then its continuity kept going in other iterations, including that character, namely Batman Beyond and Justice League. So while it maybe should have been a given this series would or should get a solid ending, I was so used to episodic television, it never crossed my mind. I especially should have expected that were I watching religiously, what with all that talk from Madam Web about an ultimate battle, and Peter needing to learn some hard lessons before he was ready to embrace his role as the Chosen One. Though now that I'm thinking about it, she calls him that way back in Season 3, but we find out here she's been testing all these other Spider-Men, and she and the Beyonder needed to test his skills as a leader during Secret Wars before they could decide if he was chosen. Doesn't seem especially well thought out to me. I don't know, maybe she just meant Spider-Man is the Chosen One and they haven't decided which Spider-Man it's going to be yet, but I'm leaping ahead. I didn't watch this show religiously or even in any particular order, though obviously I realized the order mattered a little more than it did watching Batman. So I didn't see what progression there was in getting us to this ultimate battle, and I expected it must all make sense, and I just wasn't there for it. Just like every time I checked in with the Spawn comics before I finally took a pair of pliers to my brain and wrote about them all. So I was riveted by all this continuity that seemed to pay off, as it was filled with images I remembered from the smattering of episodes I'd seen, like the time dilation portals, Man-Spider, and the Goblins finally working together. Of course, those stories weren't building toward this. Those are all just references to those events in alternate dimensions. But I saw familiar things and got excited because it made me feel like the show was rewarding me for watching. And looking back on it, while it would have been great if all those elements came together in one long, tight 5-season arc, I like seeing alternate universes that feel like variations on the world I've been watching, with similar events that turn out differently. It's like seeing Peter walk into a series of what-if stories in his own animated Marvel multiverse. I wish the Watcher had been involved, maybe even over the Beyonder. He could be all conflicted about his no-interference rule, break it once to tell Peter that all of reality is about to end, but refuse to do anything else. And that would have been a better excuse to leave things up to Peter, rather than this vague and contrived set of rules for the Beyonder's powers and how much he can expend outside his own dimension. I was also always jazzed by the inclusion of the Scarlet Spider, who was in a lot of the comics I was reading then, and I loved the idea of Peter having to face this iconic animatronic version of himself possessed by the Carnage symbiote. Remember, my first loves in Spider-Man's world were Venom and Carnage, and the Ben Reilly thing is even more fun for me years later, knowing the terrible reputation of the Clone Saga, the mother of convoluted arcs that seemed more eternal than the Beyonder himself. It was a shame at the time that the show ended before it could do a story about Ben Reilly, and considering how much of a soap opera this was, it might have been the perfect place not to turn chicken and actually let Peter be the clone and make Ben the real Peter. It would have been the most horrible thing Semper could have done to Peter. He marries a Mary Jane who turns out to be a clone, maybe finally finds her like Madam Web promises in the final seconds as she and Peter fly off into oblivion together, and once his life is back to normal, after saving existence as we know it, he's rewarded by discovering he was also a clone. I love the idea that he proves himself so selfless that Madam Web doesn't care he's a clone, even though she'd certainly know. Clearly, Semper was seeding some version of the Clone Saga with that tissue sample Miles Warren gets from Spider-Man after clone Mary Jane disintegrates, and it wouldn't make sense that there would already be a Peter Parker clone running around, but if he'd had the forethought to set that up differently, Reilly as the real Spider-Man would have fit right in with the show's brand of melodrama. Speaking of that scene with Warren, flashing back to that scene in this episode when we meet Reilly is hysterical. It plays like it's paying off something we've been waiting for. Good job. You established a major plot point for something that happens in another universe. Again, I like that these alternate worlds play with events from the one we've been watching, but I don't know that I would have called attention to that dangling cliffhanger we can't pay off, because the series is ending before we have a chance. Then again, I'm so done with reliving every precious event that's mentioned. So many are repeated 2 or 3 times throughout the series, I start getting this weird bout of deja vu. Sometimes I'm out shopping, and Black Cat walks by, and then the same identical Black Cat walks by again. Either they've changed something in the Matrix, or this show has got me repeating scenes in daydreams. Spider-Carnage might really hate clones, but I really hate flashbacks. So let's talk about Spider-Carnage. He's the best idea in the episode, as much as the message with him is laid on super thick at the end. After the great way the black costume stuff was handled, and the notion that without Peter's almost innate sense of responsibility, he would have been totally consumed by the power the symbiote offered, the idea that the destroyer of reality as we know it would be an unhinged Peter Parker with a deranged symbiote is fantastic. And though there's not enough time to get to know this Peter and draw him much more than the average psychopath-turned-monster in this show, I like the skeleton of his psychotic break, as well as what snaps him out of it. He loses Ben, becomes Spider-Man, but then loses May and feels like he's lost too much of himself. And while May doesn't feel exactly like a rock for Peter in this show, just looking at the role she's supposed to fill, I totally buy that he'd have a hard time keeping himself together if she died before he learned some of those hard lessons. Then, he finds out Ben Reilly might be the real Peter, and he's jealous to the point of madness because he loses all he really has left, his sense of identity, and with it, his purpose. Carnage suddenly popping out of a portal out of nowhere and possessing him is ridiculous, of course, but I like everything else about it. All Carnage wants is chaos and destruction, and Tutti Frutti Peter becomes the ultimate perversion of the heroic Spider-Man, who gives in to that evil in order to lash out in an unfair and unrelenting world. Reality, even. I liked Eddie Brock as the mirror for Peter, who blames everyone else for his problems. This is the ultimate version of that, facing the ultimate test of responsibility, which he finally passes when another world's Uncle Ben gives him a 30-second pep talk, and I watched the same Uncle Ben flashback I've seen 3,900 times, all thanks to our Peter, who proves he was the chosen one by having enough perspective to see the root of his doppelganger's pain, because he truly knows himself. At the very end, he gets to meet the man who invented him and see how far he's come. In a world that's like ours, except there's a popular live-action Spider-Man TV series in the 90s, and Peter Parker is an actor who plays, Peter Parker. Or maybe he's not Peter Parker and he just sounds and looks exactly like him. I don't know. It's pretty good stuff idea-wise, executed about as well as this show usually is. All the cosmic stuff leading up to it is laughably convoluted, and it watches like the show doesn't really know what Peter's final challenge will be until we get there. Madam Web and the Beyonder are taking some giant risks trying to mold Peter with wise sayings and rhetorical nonsense, saying the only way to stop Spider-Carnage is for Peter to understand himself. Really? That's the only way to deter a 6.5-foot monster from throwing an incendiary bomb into a time dilation portal. Why do all of Peter's teammates also have to be Spider-Men if only one of them has to effectively psychoanalyze his evil counterpart? Okay, the Beyonder only has so much power to bring people to Ben Reilly's dimension, so he can't bring a whole army. I mean, he apparently only had so much power to bring heroes to the Secret Wars too, and now he's expending even more energy to put together the Spider-Man 6, so I question that limitation, but okay. Why not bring more powerful heroes? Why not bring some of the X-Men? And not just the one whose powers might be a match for the Beyonders. What? Weather versus omnipotence? Yeah, that's compatible. Peter actually compares Storm's powers to the Beyonders. But, like, all the X-Men. Better yet, why not go further back in time and try to talk Spider-Carnage down way before he's just about to throw a multiverse-killing bomb into a portal? You don't know if it'll work, but then again, the timing is really close here. It's interesting going back to this now and seeing all the recognizable ideas that are all over modern Spider-Man comics, but were new and fan servicey at this time. Alternate reality Gwen Stacy, a bunch of Spider-Men coming together to form a team, and at the time of this recording, Clone Conspiracy has just wrapped up. We still can't get away from Miles Warren and Ben Reilly, though Dan Slott brings everything back. But who am I kidding? The real reason this episode is on the list is hearing Kingpin in his high society sophisticate voice say, Spider-Carnage. And there they are, my 10 favorite episodes from a nostalgic, sometimes smart and thoughtful, but often bizarre take on a classic coming-of-age story about a kid just trying to figure out who he is and what he's all about, suddenly with the weight of the world on his shoulders. Uh-oh. I feel an intrusive and retroactively reworked flashback coming on. My number 10 pick is Return of the Green Goblin. My 9th pick is Shriek of the Vulture and The Final Nightmare. My 8th pick is the series finale, Spider Wars. My 7th pick is Framed and The Man Without Fear. My number 6 pick is The Insidious 6 and Battle of the Insidious 6. My 5th pick is The Mutant Agenda. My 4th pick is The Spot. My 3rd pick is The Menace of Mysterio. My number 2 pick is Enter the Green Goblin, and my number 1 pick is the alien costume. But I don't think this journey back to the land of neogenics, spider slayers, and off-screen relationships would be complete without a look at some of the most bizarre moments of the series. So I leave you with a bonus, my 5 favorite oddest moments from Spider-Man, or Spider-Man the Animated Series, or Marvel Comics Spider-Man, totally commentary-free. Enjoy.
No, Miranda, you mustn't!
To the contrary, Kittens! I must! At last, my face, my body restored to me! Quentin! What went wrong? I'm still trapped in my own body! Quentin!
I can't fix it.
You must remember.
Elsie, are you okay?
Of course I am, girl. Takes more than a big bad fish man to hurt the old mousey.
I know you.
Yes, you do.
I've got to remember. I must try. I must.
I'm your greatest fan ever.
And you must have the faith of a child.
Showbiz?
Hyena.
Spider-Man!
Sarah!
Mac, what are you doing? You can't go out in public. If they caught you, they'd put you in jail. I'd never see you again.
But Sarah, honey, don't you want me to be normal?
We'll get the money. It'll be okay. I've already saved $500.
Wow! $500 whole dollars. By the time we have enough, my young self will look like I do now. Don't you ever insult her again. I'll do it your way.
Thank you, Mac. We'll make it, I promise. Then we can get married.
He's jamming the cartridges. The pressure's too much.
I can't get your life force, but I get the rest of you.
I know of only 2 such subjects.
Scorpion and the Vulture?
Then get one of them at once.
The problem is, they've gone underground, vanished. However, that's where this lovely creature may help us. By holding her hostage, we may be able to force Spider-Man to do our legwork. Make him find Scorpion and Vulture for us.
Ah, clever idea. Spider-Man's weakness is that he cares too much. Good work, Smythe. Quickly, change my diaper.
Papa.